In the early hours of July 10, 1973, a 16-year-old boy disappeared from the streets of Rome. His name was John Paul Getty III. He was young, restless, famous in the small circles that cared about rich children behaving badly. An heir to one of the most powerful fortunes in the world. But that night, none of it protected him. Not the name, not the money, not the oil fields, not the private estates, the art collections, the trust funds, or the family mythology that made the Getty name sound almost untouchable. The kidnappers knew exactly what that name meant. Getty meant oil. Getty meant power. Getty meant old money with a new American edge. Getty meant a fortune so large that from the outside, it seemed impossible for the family to ever be powerless. So they demanded $17 million. For most families, that number would have ended the conversation. For the Gettys, it began there. Because the missing boy's grandfather was John Paul Getty, one of the richest men alive. A man whose fortune was so immense that newspapers struggled to describe it without sounding exaggerated. A man who owned art, estates, companies, and pieces of the world that most people would never even see. But when the ransom demand came, Getty did not immediately reach for his checkbook. He refused. The world saw a billionaire. The kidnappers saw a fortune. But inside the Getty family, the money was not a rescue plan. It was a weapon, a wall, a test of control, and on one side of that wall was a terrified teenager. On the other side was a grandfather who had spent his life learning that money should never be surrendered under pressure. The Getty kidnapping became one of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century because of what happened to the boy. But it became a legend because of what his family did not do. For months, the world watched as one of the richest families on earth treated a human life like a negotiation. Then, an envelope arrived. Inside was a lock of hair and a severed ear. Only then did the Getty fortune begin to move. But by then, the story was no longer only about a kidnapping. It was about a dynasty so rich that money had stopped feeling human, a family so powerful that affection had become conditional, a name so valuable that the people born into it could be damaged by it, abandoned by it, and still never escape it. The Gettys did not begin as a cursed family. They began with ambition. Before the kidnapping, before the mansions, before the famous museum, before the whispered stories about coldness and tragedy, there was oil. The fortune began with George Franklin Getty, a lawyer from Minnesota who entered the oil business when America itself was being remade by what lay beneath the ground. Oil was not elegant. It was not marble halls. It was not art galleries or private clubs. It was leases, derricks, contracts, mud, risk, a gamble that something hidden under the earth might change a family forever. George Getty understood the gamble, but it was his son, John Paul Getty, who would turn it into an empire. John Paul Getty was born in 1892. From early on, he absorbed a lesson that would shape everything around him. Money was not simply something to earn. Money was something to master. He studied at Oxford. He learned the manners of privilege, but he also learned the rougher language of oil fields, land deals, production rights, and leverage. He was young when he entered the oil business, very young, and by his early 20s, he had made his first million. For most men, that would have been the peak. For Getty, it was evidence, proof that he understood the machinery of the world better than other people did. He came to believe in patience, in bargaining, in refusing to overpay, in waiting until the other side became desperate. These qualities made him extraordinary in business. They made him dangerous inside a family. Because the same instincts that build a fortune can poison a home. A businessman who refuses to be pressured may become a father who refuses to be moved. A negotiator who sees every demand as a trap may become a grandfather who hears a ransom note and thinks first about precedent. And that was the contradiction at the center of the Getty dynasty. The fortune was built by risk. But the family culture became defined by suspicion. J. Paul Getty could spend enormous sums on oil concessions, artwork, antiquities, and properties. He could imagine legacy on a grand scale. He could build a name that outlived him. But in ordinary human moments, he was famously reluctant to part with money. He became known not only for wealth, but for thrift. The stories followed him everywhere. The bargaining, the careful spending, the payphone at Sutton Place, his grand English estate, so guests could pay for their own calls. The image was almost absurd. One of the richest men in the world, surrounded by luxury, still watching the small coins. To some, it was eccentric. To others, it was proof of discipline. But inside the Getty story, it became something darker. Because Getty did not simply save money. He controlled it, and everyone around him felt that control. He married 5 times. He had 5 sons. But he was not a warm patriarch in the simple, comforting sense. He was distant, commanding, restless. A man who could own almost anything, but seemed unable to create closeness without hierarchy. The Getty family had money, but money was not the same as safety. It was not the same as belonging. It was not the same as love. As the Getty name grew, the gap between the public myth and the private family widened. To the outside world, J. Paul Getty was a symbol of American achievement. The oil billionaire, the collector, the man who moved through life with the strange authority of someone who could buy what others could only admire. But inside the family, being a Getty could feel less like protection than exposure. Every heir carried the name, not every heir carried power. Every child was close to the fortune. Not every child could access it. That distinction mattered. Because in the Getty family, money was not simply inherited. It was withheld, measured, negotiated, used to remind people where they stood. And no one understood that better than the branch of the family that would become trapped at the center of the kidnapping. John Paul Getty III was born in 1956. His father was John Paul Getty Jr., one of J. Paul Getty's sons. His mother was Gail Harris. Paul, as the boy was known, inherited the name. But he did not inherit stability. His parents' marriage broke down. His father struggled with his own distance from the patriarch and his own private demons. His mother was left raising children in the shadow of a fortune she did not control. That was one of the cruelest parts of the Getty world. From the outside, the family looked unimaginably rich. But inside, access depended on position. A surname could make you a target. It did not necessarily give you protection. Gail's son carried the Getty name. Kidnappers could look at him and see millions. But Gail herself could not simply produce millions. She was close enough to the fortune for criminals to demand it, but not powerful enough to command it. By the early 1970s, Paul Getty III was living in Rome. And Rome was beautiful, ancient, cinematic, a city of fountains, churches, ruins, cafes, stone streets, and night air. But Rome in the early 1970s was not only romance and history. Italy was moving through a period of political tension, social unrest, organized crime, and kidnappings that targeted wealthy families. A famous surname could become a liability. A young heir could become a price tag. Paul drifted through that world with the carelessness of someone old enough to rebel, but too young to understand the full danger of being known. He was striking looking, with long red hair and the haunted glamour of the era. He moved around artists, models, nightclubs, cafes, and outsiders. He had been expelled from school. He sold paintings. He lived like a boy trying to step outside the family myth while still carrying the name that made him visible. To some people, he looked spoiled. To others, he looked lost. And maybe he was both. That is one of the uncomfortable truths about dynastic heirs. They can appear privileged and abandoned at the same time. They can have access to rooms most people never enter. while still lacking the ordinary protections of a stable home. They can reject the family name in public, then discover that the rest of the world never forgets it. Paul Getty III was not the head of the family. He did not control the oil money. He was not a decision maker. He was not J. Paul Getty. He was 16, but to dangerous men, he was close enough. The Getty name made him valuable, and in July 1973, that value became a trap. He was kidnapped in Rome. The first ransom demand was $17 million. The number was almost theatrical. It was not designed around the boy's mother, it was designed around the grandfather. A normal ransom asks what a family can afford. This ransom asked what the Getty name was worth. At first, the case was clouded by doubt. Paul had reportedly joked before about the idea of staging his own kidnapping to get money. Because of that reputation, some initially wondered if the disappearance might be a scheme. It was a cruel suspicion, but it also revealed something important about the Getty family system. Even when a child vanished, trust did not arrive first. Doubt did. Suspicion did. The family had more money than almost anyone on earth, but not enough trust to respond simply, not enough unity to move as one, not enough tenderness to immediately believe the worst had happened. And so the boy disappeared into captivity while the adults argued over reality. Was it real? Was it staged? Was it a stunt? Was it a trap? The kidnappers waited. The police investigated. The press circled. And Gail Getty found herself in an impossible position. She was the mother of the missing boy. But she was not the keeper of the fortune. She could plead. She could push. She could speak to authorities. She could try to keep the story alive. She could live every hour with the terror that her son might be hungry, beaten, sick, or dead. But she could not simply pay $17 million. The man who could pay was J. Paul Getty, and Getty said no. His reasoning became infamous. He argued that if he paid one ransom, his other grandchildren could become targets. There was a cold logic to it. A billionaire with many descendants could not appear endlessly vulnerable. If he paid once, would kidnappers come again? If he gave in, would the family name become an open invitation? This was how Getty thought, in systems, in incentives, in consequences, in the long-term cost of surrendering leverage. But logic becomes something else when it is applied without mercy. The question the public began to ask was painfully simple. What is the point of being one of the richest men in the world if your grandson can be held hostage and the money still does not move? For Getty, money was not only rescue, money was precedent, money was power, money was something that, once surrendered, could never fully be controlled again. So he waited. And Paul waited too. Only Paul waited in captivity. That is where the Getty story becomes darker than a crime story. Because the kidnappers were brutal, but they were not the only source of horror. The horror was also in the gap between wealth and care. Every day Paul remained missing. The contradiction grew larger. The Getty fortune could build museums. It could buy masterpieces. It could acquire estates. It could move through the world with the force of a private kingdom. But it could not produce a simple family response. Bring him home. Instead, the case became a negotiation. A teenager's body became a bargaining chip between criminals, police, relatives, lawyers, and one of the most stubborn billionaires alive. The family's private dysfunction became international news, and the longer it lasted, the more the public image began to crack. Because a kidnapping usually turns a family outward. It creates urgency. It creates unity. It makes everything else seem small. But in the Getty family, the kidnapping exposed the machinery underneath. Money, control, suspicion, distance, old wounds, people who shared a name but not a shared center. Gail was trapped inside the cruel architecture of dynastic wealth. She was close enough to the Gettys to suffer from the name, but not close enough to command the rescue. Her son's kidnappers believed the family had limitless money. In one sense, they were right. In another, they misunderstood everything. The Getty fortune was enormous, but it did not flow like love. It moved through structures, decisions, permissions, terms, authority. And authority still belonged to the patriarch. John Paul Getty was living in England at Sutton Place, the grand Tudor estate that seemed to embody old-world power. Stone walls, long rooms, art, silence, distance. It was the kind of house that looked like protection. But from that house, Getty held firm. The public saw a billionaire in a mansion. Inside the family, people saw something more complicated. A man who had built his life by refusing pressure. A man who believed that giving in invited ruin. A man who could turn even a ransom demand into a negotiation over principle. But outside Sutton Place, the story was not theoretical. Somewhere in Italy, Paul Getty III was a child in captivity. The kidnappers had taken his freedom. The family delay took something else. It took away the comforting belief that if things became bad enough, the money would come. Weeks passed, then months. The first shock faded. The story might have become another unsolved disappearance, another ugly crime swallowed by time. But the kidnappers were not finished. They needed proof. They needed pressure. They needed the family, the police, and the world to understand that the boy was not pretending. In November, an envelope was sent to a newspaper. Inside was a lock of Paul's hair and one of his ears. The message was unmistakable. The delay had a cost. The kidnapping was real. The boy was alive, but being destroyed. This was the point of no return. Until then, the family could argue about strategy. They could doubt. They could delay. They could talk about precedent and risk and future consequences. But the severed ear changed the moral shape of the story. It turned a private negotiation into public shame. It forced the world to stare at the human price of the Getty family's coldness. Now the question was no longer whether paying the ransom might create danger later. The danger had already arrived. It had entered the family through the most vulnerable person. Not the patriarch. Not the executives, not the men who made the oil deals. A 16-year-old boy. The kidnappers had understood something that perhaps the family itself had forgotten. A dynasty is never tested at its strongest point. It is tested at its weakest. And Paul was the weakness, not because he was worthless, because he was unprotected. After the ear was sent, the negotiations changed. The original demand had already shifted. The amount came down. Getty eventually agreed to pay part of the ransom. But even then, the rescue carried the strange signature of the family. It was not simple. It was not immediate. It was not an open-handed act of desperation. Reports have long described the arrangement as partial payment from Getty and a loan to his son for the rest. Even rescue came with terms. That is one of the reasons the story remained so unforgettable. The money moved, but it moved like a financial instrument, not like an embrace. It was as though the Getty family could not stop being the Getty family, even when a child's life depended on it. In December 1973, Paul Getty III was finally released. He was found alive in southern Italy. Alive, but changed. The family had its heir back, but not whole, not untouched, not protected from the knowledge of what had happened while he waited. There are traumas that end when the victim comes home, and there are traumas that only begin there. For Paul, the kidnapping became the central fact of his life. He was no longer simply a rebellious young heir. He was the boy whose grandfather refused to pay, the boy whose ear was cut off, the boy whose suffering became a symbol of the grotesque distance between money and love. That kind of fame does not fade. It follows. And what followed Paul was not only public attention, it was pain. The body can leave captivity before the mind does. Paul returned to a world that knew the details of his humiliation. His kidnapping had become a headline. His ransom had become a moral debate. His family's hesitation had become part of his identity. Every retelling made him a symbol, but symbols are not allowed to heal quietly. He was still young, still trying to live, still trying to become something other than the kidnapped Getty heir. In 1974, he married Gisela Martine Zacher, who had known him before the abduction. He became a father young. For a time he moved through artistic and social circles, trying to create a life beyond the family story. But the shadow remained. Addiction followed him, instability followed him. The damage of the kidnapping did not stay in the past where a documentary might prefer to leave it. It entered his body, his habits, his relationships, his future. In 1981, after a combination of drugs and alcohol, Paul suffered a devastating medical crisis. He had liver failure and a stroke. He was left severely disabled, partially blind, unable to speak, a quadriplegic, still alive, but imprisoned again. This time not by kidnappers, by his own body. The story had turned almost unbearably cruel. The boy who was once held for ransom became a man who needed care for the rest of his life. And once again, money did not behave like mercy. Medical bills, family disputes, and questions of responsibility followed. The Getty fortune was still there. The name was still there. But the human being at the center of the story continued to suffer. Paul Getty III died in 2011. He was 54 years old. For many families, an obituary is a summary of a life. For Paul, it became a return to the same event. The kidnapping, the ransom, the heir, the grandfather, the fortune, the story had swallowed him. That is what dynastic scandal can do. It can reduce a person to the worst thing that ever happened to them. And in Paul's case, the worst thing was not only the crime, it was the revelation. The realization that his famous name could attract danger, but not guarantee rescue. The Getty family continued. The name continued. The institutions continued. The money did what dynastic money is designed to do. It survived. John Paul Getty died in 1976, only a few years after the kidnapping. His wealth helped build one of the most powerful cultural institutions in the world. The Getty name became attached not only to oil and scandal, but to art, conservation, architecture, and public culture. Visitors could walk through bright museum courtyards, look at masterpieces, and see a fortune transformed into civilization. That is one Getty legacy. It is real, but it is not the only one. There is another Getty legacy. It lives in the story of a boy on a Roman street. A ransom note. A mother without enough power. A grandfather with almost unlimited money and very limited tenderness. A family so rich that outsiders assumed it could solve anything. And yet, inside the house, the thing most needed was the thing money could not guarantee. Protection. The Getty kidnapping exposed something people often suspect about dynasties, but rarely see so clearly. A fortune can make a family famous. It can make a name immortal. It can build museums, buy estates, and place portraits on walls. But it cannot make people love each other. It cannot force a father to be present. It cannot make a grandfather tender. It cannot turn inheritance into intimacy. And when money becomes the center of a family system, every relationship begins to orbit it. Children learn where they rank. Spouses learn what they can ask for. Heirs learn that the name is both privilege and burden. Outsiders learn that the family has a price. The Getty fortune was built underground, in oil fields, in hidden pressure beneath the earth. The Getty curse worked the same way. For years, pressure built quietly inside the family. Marriages cracked, children drifted, fathers disappeared into distance, addiction, resentment, or silence. The patriarch kept control. The name grew larger. The people inside it grew smaller. Then, in 1973, the pressure broke into public view, not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, not in a will, but through a kidnapped boy whose life became a negotiation. That is why the Getty story still feels disturbing, not because a rich family suffered, but because their suffering revealed the emptiness at the center of the myth. The public saw billions, but inside the family, there was fear. The public saw mansions, but inside the family, there was abandonment. The public saw a name that could buy almost anything. But when the moment came, the name could not immediately buy mercy. A dynasty does not usually collapse in one moment. It collapses in private rooms, in old grudges, in children who grow up around money, but not warmth, in marriages treated like transactions, in fathers who disappear, in heirs who inherit attention before they inherit stability, in families that become so skilled at protecting the fortune that they forget to protect each other. The Getty kidnapping did not destroy the Getty name. In some ways, nothing did. The name survived. The money survived. The museum survived. The mythology survived. But the kidnapping revealed what survival had cost, because sometimes the greatest threat to a dynasty is not outside the gates. It is already inside the house. And in the Getty family, the curse was not that they had too little. It was that they had everything, except the one thing a kidnapped child needed most: someone willing to put him before the money. For more stories about wealth, power, betrayal, dynasties, and the families behind the world's most famous fortunes, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss out on our next episode.